I'm responding to the claim by Angela Reyes that violent video games contribute to aggressive behavior problems in those who play them. My opponent's claims were that violent video games increase aggression in individuals, which make individuals more prone to violence. Her second claim was those who play violent video games may experience long-lasting negative effects in the brain compared to those who don't. And her third claim was that video games are interactive and allow players to take part in violent scenarios, encouraging problematic violent behavior more so than other forms of violent media. The first claim was that violent video games increase aggression in individuals, which make individuals more prone to violence. My counterclaim is that violent video games do not causally increase aggression in individuals. On the first page of my opponent's article, Firefight, Should Teens Play Video Games?, I found my opponent's argument. However, reading more in depth in the article, I found contrary evidence. The article stated, the game's competitive content isn't anything most teens haven't seen before. Teens are smart enough to know the difference between real life and games. Evan Jones, a 16-year-old, says, I get an adrenaline rush during the game, and I need to win, but afterward, it's just fine. I see violent video games as an outlet to aggression and stress. There are also other factors that lead to aggression that many studies don't address. A study done by International Association for Correctional and Forensic Psychology showed that trait aggression, family violence, and male gender were predictive of violent crime, but exposure to violent games was not. This shows that there are other factors that lead to aggression that are not necessarily linked to violent video games. According to a study done by psychologist Christopher Ferguson, there is a problem with publication bias, and he found that the relationship between video game habits and aggressive behavior was effectively 0%, and any relationship between aggressive behavior and violent video games is merely a correlation and not a causation. The second claim that my opponent made was those who play violent video games may experience long-lasting negative effects in the brain compared to those who don't. My response to that is that my opponent's lack of evidence fails to support her claim that violent video games may result in long-term problems. My opponent only gave one example. She compared brain activity of the group that played non-violent video games to a group that played a violent video game. The evidence only explains the brain activity while playing the game, but it does not explain any long-term effects. So therefore, it's not reasonable to assume that the brain activity causes any long-term effects. Also, I found a similar experiment by Marthiak and Weaver that said, although they observed patterns of suppressed affective structures induced by virtual violent interactions, the current experiment does not prove whether the rehearsal of such mechanism can promote aggressive behavior in real life. So even though there is stimulation of the brain, it does not mean that it either causes aggression or that it causes long-term effects. My opponent's third claim was that video games are interactive and allow players to take part in violent scenarios, encouraging problematic violent behavior more so than other forms of violent media. I'm challenging her reasoning by saying that violent video games do not represent realistic situations and cannot be used as a teaching method. In response to the argument that violent video games can teach players how to perform violent acts, psychologist Marcus Shikolsky claims the argument depends on the plausibility of analogy between actions in a game and the real world. In order for this criticism to work, there must be a high degree of similarity. The problem my opponent is making is that she assumes that video games are similar to real life, when in reality, the only thing realistic about video games is their graphics. For example, Guitar Hero simulates playing guitar while pressing buttons. However, this does not teach you how to play guitar in real life. Just like Guitar Hero doesn't teach you how to play guitar, pressing a mouse or gamepad does not teach players how to shoot a real gun or perform other violent acts in real life. Therefore, it's unreasonable to assume that violent video games teach people how to perform violent acts. In conclusion, my claims that violent video games do not causally increase aggression in individuals, and any relationship is merely correlation. My opponent's lack of evidence fails to support her claim that violent video games may result in long-term problems, and violent video games do not represent realistic situations and cannot be used as a teaching method.
Right, all the structural stuff is fine. You labeled the main and secondary claims. When you got to the first point, there's a clear signpost. The argument is basically there's no causality on that issue, and then you try to proceed to explain why not. I like the fact that you referred to other information in the advocate's own article. That's fine. I like the fact that you also had outside information that showed that you can't really use this as a way of predicting aggression. I thought that that was pretty reasonable, and that's very clear. When you mentioned the idea of publication bias, I'm not exactly sure what the person that you're quoting means by that, and I'm not sure how it necessarily applies to the argument that's presenting here. That seemed to me to be a sidetrack issue. On the second point, you challenged the application of the evidence, the notion that brain activity, for instance, is measured, but the question about long-term effects, you have a challenge on that. There's not really any data that's directly about the study that the advocate cited in that particular case, but you'd have your own research that shows that there's no proof that a stimulus can lead to this long-term aggressiveness, and I thought that that was a reasonable piece of information to put in at that point since you didn't have anything specific about the advocate's research. The transition to the third point was very clear. The idea that it's not really an effective teaching method. I think you explained the analogy idea pretty effectively and argue that there is a substantial difference. I like the analogy that you draw to Guitar Hero and how that doesn't teach you to play the guitar, so we shouldn't assume that being able to do point and shoot first-person video games means that we are being learned, that we're learning to behave in an aggressive way. Plus, I think that there's some other information that you presented earlier that suggests that there's not really a strong relationship there. I did like the way that you summarized your argument at the end. That makes it a lot clearer, and the truth is that's the thing that's going to be able to stick with people. Having heard everything you've said, what does it all mean? I think that that is an effective way of finishing off.